This is Pastor Tim Turner, and you are watching a Global Methodist Church organization and administration part one, a little bit of a training, but particularly focused on local church organization and administration. There's going to be two parts to the local church organization administrative conversation, and then we'll have some other ones with conference structure and general conference structure. This is an introduction. I represent the School of Ministry in the Trinity Conference of the Global Methodist Church, serving as the dean of the School of Ministry. And in that role, I also am on the board of ministry for the conference. And so this training is aimed at equipping local churches with understanding what a local GMC church structure looks like. I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. So in the Global Methodist Church, the paragraph 336 of the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline. On a side note, this presentation might need to be updated some after General Conference, but in carrying out its mission, adequate provision should be made to evangelize and spread scriptural holiness. That's part of our Book of Doctrine and Discipline. Very important statement to begin us with, because the primary purpose of the church is for evangelism and scriptural holiness. It is for those purposes of making disciples of Jesus Christ. And any conversation of administration needs to begin rooted right there in our mission and our values to make disciples of Jesus Christ. So a quick run through of our structure in the GMC. We are connectional. This means that we're related in connection with one another. We are not a grouping of isolated churches. We are in connection with one another, which means we have a general conference. That's the gathering of all Global Methodist churches. This is 2024, the date of this recording. And in September of 2024, the global connection of Global Methodist will meet together in Costa Rica for the first general conference. We are not isolated churches. We are connected all over the world. In the closer sense, we're connected to the annual conference. Now, my annual conference is the Trinity Conference. We encompass Louisiana, Arkansas, and all of Eastern Texas. And this annual conference meets annually. And right now there's legislation that's going to be considered at General Conference for the primary leader of the conference to be referred to as a conference superintendent. That's not final yet, but that's part of the proposal. The bishops in the GMC, they currently lead at the General Conference level, leading multiple annual conferences at the same time. Again, we're still working through the role of the bishop. Now, closer at hand to the local church is the district, or if you're in the Trinity Conference, we call these areas. I just referenced I'm in the Piney Woods area. The Book of Doctrine and Discipline uses the language of district. Now, when we talk about our districts, this is our relationship to one another in mission. We're much closer at hand. In my area, again, my district, we have about 38 churches that are related in a mission with one another. And that grouping of churches is led by a presiding elder. That's a later conversation to be had when we talk about conference structure in administration organization. But for now, that's just part of our overview. And today we're talking about the local church. The local church has primarily a disciple-making mission. And I want to get to the nuts and bolts of that. The local church is a strategic base from which Christians move out to the structures of society. So you can see that the local church, again, returning to that primary mission and values, its primary mission is making disciples of Jesus Christ. And we need to be thinking about our local churches as these outposts of the kingdom, these outposts of mission. In other words, as Methodists, we organize for the sake of fulfilling the gospel mission. We don't organize for the sake of just doing institutional church. We organize for the sake of our mission to make disciples of Jesus. And so any conversation of organization must keep that primary task and mission in the context of its community as we talk about all organizational work. I'm a visual person. I like charts. I like graphs. This particular chart I'll come back to a few times as we talk today. The Charge Conference you see is the church conference. The Charge Conference is the highest leadership body in the church, and the church council is beneath that, and from there administrative functions. We'll talk through this chart all the way through. So let's start with the Charge Conference, the church conference. We're going to work through the difference between a charge conference and a church conference. 338 spells out the charge conference. It's the basic unit in the connectional system. So notice the annual conference is not the basic unit in the connectional system. The charge conference is. So what is the charge conference? Well, quite simply, it's all members of the church council plus ministers. In a minute, that'll make sense as we talk about the church council, but that's a basic baseline definition. The presiding elder has to be the one to call a charge conference. Now, the presiding elder can delegate who's overseeing the charge conference, but a local church cannot call their own charge conference. The primary reason of this is we're connectional. We're not just a grouping of independent churches, and local churches need charge conferences in order to accomplish some administrative tasks. Well, we need the presiding elder present because we're in a connection of mission with other churches as well. The charge conference is all the churches on the charge together. So I pastor two churches, St. Augustine Methodist and Chirino Methodist. When we have a charge conference, both churches need to be present. A church conference is slightly different. Notice a charge conference are the members of church council plus the ministers, but a church conference is all professing members of the local church, all professing members. So in the Trinity Conference, instead of doing an annual charge conference this past year, we actually did church conferences. They accomplish a similar goal. The big difference is in a church conference, anyone and everyone that is a professing member of the church can vote. What is a professing member? Well, you'll have to tune into part 2 of this video. I'm going to walk through the different categories of membership in the local church. The powers and duties of a charge conference are good to name because then it makes sense of why we do this annually with the presiding elder present. So the charge conference is the connecting link between the local church, the annual conference, and the general conference. Again, this is where we get our connectionalism from the local church level. And the charge conference has the oversight of the church council and the overall ministry of the local church. And so at a charge conference meeting, we might elect leaders. We'd recommend ministry candidates. You have to have a charge conference for that. You have to have a charge conference to set the pastor's compensation. This has to be something set by the charge conference. Also, in some instances, when there's a building campaign or when there's a new building project or a new church start, a church launch, some of these projects need a church charge conference in order to go forward. Okay, again, we look at our administrative flow chart and we see that charge conference may only meet once a year, maybe twice a year at the convening of the presiding elder, but a church council is going to be our day-to-day leadership body for organization. So let's look at the church council. The church council shall be amenable to and function as the administrative agency of the charge conference. So notice the church council is the one on the day-to-day functionings. It's providing for the planning, implementing of ministry. And what is that ministry? Well, notice it's not just about the trustees' work. It's not just about the SBRC's work. We're going to work through those terms in a moment. Don't worry if I lost you just now. Primarily, according to paragraph 343, it's a ministry of evangelizing and spreading scriptural holiness. I want to pause and make a commentary here. if our church councils are not primarily focusing on the mission of the church to make disciples of Jesus Christ, those missions of evangelizing, reaching the lost, and spreading scriptural holiness, bringing us on to perfection, as we say in Wesleyan theology, then our church councils have lost their vision. Our church councils should primarily be about the planning and implementing of the church's mission. Now, the church council does provide for the administration of the church's temporal life. The charge conference meeting once a year, well, that can't do that. The church council meets much more frequently. In a church council meeting, we do visioning, we do planning, we implement, we annually evaluate what's going on in the church. These are the functions of the church council. They happen through committees. We will talk about the committees in a moment, but this is the function of the church council. What about the meetings of the church council? Well, at least we're required to meet quarterly with the church council, according to 343. Now, the pastor or the chairperson can call special meetings. A reason must be stated if there's a special meeting outside of those previously planned. Now, according to paragraph 343, decision is actually made by consensus at church council, driven by the Holy Spirit. A simple majority is what we default to if we can't achieve consensus. Consensus is a little bit higher bar than even 2/3. Consensus is we want to make sure we're all moving together. We don't want to just take a willy-nilly vote and be outvoted. We want to make sure we're moving together. Sometimes reaching consensus is hard, and so that's when we would default on a simple majority vote. We don't really want to take a simple majority vote, because think about this. If we have 10 people in our church council and 6 of them want one thing and 4 of them want the other, that's technically a simple majority, but it's a division. And so we want to work towards consensus, which is a much higher bar than just simple majority. Sometimes, however, we do need to make a vote and a decision, and that's when we would default to a simple majority. The responsibilities of a church council. Well, this paragraph is really good to read, by the way, for especially the church council chair, the lay leader, especially reading this paragraph 343, understanding what the church council's function is. Because the church council, with the pastor, annually reviews the membership of the church and what it means to be a member. Also, anytime there's an interim leadership vacancy, now we're not talking about necessarily pastoral vacancies. Those happen in consultation with the presiding elder. We're talking about if a member of the SBRC or even the chair of the finance committee, if there's a vacancy between charge conferences. Remember, the charge conference is the body that finalizes nominations, finalizes officers. However, the church council is authorized to fill those vacancies between charge conferences. There's actually the church council is the one who establishes a budget. Now notice the budget, however, is finally approved by charge conference. It's sent to charge conference from church council. A charge conference is who? A charge conference is the church council meetings along with the pastor with the presiding elder present. So it has to pass a 2-time vote. It seems like a secondary layer to have a charge conference, but this is good and right. It helps us stay in connection with the presiding elder on what's going on. So the church council does establish an annual budget recommended by the finance committee. And there is a recommendation of salary housing that's made to the church conference. That recommendation begins, however, in the Staff Parish Relations Committee, SPRC. We'll talk about these committees a little bit in just a short while. Who are the members of the church council? Well, it's as few as 8 people, but as many as set by the charge conference. And there are some churches where getting 8 different people for the church council might be a difficult situation. Sometimes in some church situations, there are people who double up on roles. However, best practice is to have as few as 8 people, but as many as set by charge conference. I know one church who they have on their church council slate of officers, they say, and members at large. Well, That's okay. It's not best practice to have that for our church council. That's okay, because essentially if we do that, we're holding a type of church conference every single time the church council meets. And there's a reason we don't do that. But the church conference can decide that that's what we want to do. We want every professing member to have a voice and a vote at church council meetings. The church conference is the one who decides that. Now, who are the members? Well, you want your chairs there, especially administrative chairs, chairs of SPRC, finance trustees, the lay leader, the lay member to annual conference, the council chair. These are all members of the church council, along with the pastor. We might also add different chairs of ministry teams, such as a chair of a missions team, a chair of worship committee, a chair of maybe a hospitality committee. And so we go back to our flow chart here for a moment, and you can see that beneath the church council, you have those administrative committees, nominations, trustees, finance, and SBRC. But you also have ministry functions. Again, the church council wants to maintain the focus on the mission of the church. And so within those ministry functions, we might also want to invite the chairs of those teams to be part of the church council. The church conference is the one who votes on that. Okay, so let's go to our administrative committees of the church council. Notice I'm just focusing on the administrative committees. The ministry committees are going to be different for every single church. But just focusing on the administrative committees that Global Methodist churches need to have. Now, we use the word committee. However, it may be a representative. There are some churches who have a one board model, or some churches who have too few of members to have a full committee for these different functions. So we hear the word committee, but that sometimes that means a representative who's responsible for these particular functions of the church council. I find it helpful to first ask, what is a committee? We use that word all the time, but we don't usually define it. Let's define it. A committee is a group of people appointed for a specific function, typically consisting of members of a larger group. Let's break that down. It's a group of people appointed. Well, who appoints them? The church council is who appoints these committees, which means the church council gets a final vote on committee decisions. It's consisting, it's a committee of the church council, so it's authorized by the church council to fulfill a particular function. Committees, they give account to the church council. They are accountable to the church council. In other words, the church council commits to this group. They commit to this group a certain charge, a certain function. What are the local church administrative committees? We saw that on the flow chart. Nominations and leadership development. You can find all this in the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline. The Pastor Parish Relations Committee, which is sometimes referred to as Staff Parish Relations Committee. I typically refer to it as Staff Parish Relations Committee, SPRC. My church has staff, and so we do refer to Staff Parish Relations Committee. The Board of Trustees, the Finance Committee, and any other administrative and program committees assigned by the Charge Conference. That might be our ministry functions, for instance. But let's just talk about administrative functions. You can find the nominations and leadership development in 344. The pastor is the chairperson of the nominations and leadership development. A layperson can be elected as vice chair, but the pastor is the chair. And there's a good reason for this. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, but there is a good reason that the pastor is the chairperson of nominations and leadership development. The main responsibility of this group, this committee, is to develop, evaluate, identify local church leadership. And so the final product of this group annually is a nominations report to Charge Conference. It might be presented to Church Council first, but Charge Conference is the one who approves the officers finally. So the nominations team guides the Church Council on matters regarding lay leadership of the congregation. And this is an important function of the church. We often have officers roll off and roll on. And in fact, you're about to hear every single administrative committee has a requirement to roll officers off and new ones on, which means we need a team that helps fill those spots and helps develop new leadership. Let's start with the Pastor Parish Relations Committee after nominations. So those responsibilities are in 345. Again, if you're on one of these committees, or if you're the church council chair, or if you're a pastor of a local church, I recommend you go look at these paragraphs. So I love the function of the SPRC or the PPRC, however you refer to it in your church. I love it as a pastor because I love to just have that group as a confidential sounding board. And the main function of that group is to be the in between, but in a positive, upbuilding kind of way. Voicing the needs of the church while also voicing the needs of the pastor. And so there is an important function there where that team defends, supports, uplifts the pastor, and also defends, supports, and uplifts the needs of the congregation. So this team is tasked with doing constructive evaluations of the pastor and staff annually, and assessing or recommending ministry candidates. So if there's a candidate for ministry, they are approved by the SPRC. This group also assesses compensation of the pastor, salary package, housing allowance. This group also has a hand in parsonage upkeep and maintenance, if there is such a thing at your church. Now notice they do that in partnership with the finance committee, because of course the SPRC does not oversee the money. And so there is a need to work with the finance committee on developing the compensation package that will best support your pastor. This team meets at least quarterly. That's a requirement, and only with the knowledge of the pastor. The team cannot meet without the knowledge of the pastor. There can be a private meeting with the presiding elder that doesn't have the pastor there. However, the pastor has to be notified of the meeting, and then immediately after has to be updated about the meeting, about the contents of the meeting, as much as that pastor needs to hear those contents. It meets in closed session. Anytime the SPRC meets, this is a private meeting. Even if your church has a one board model, if there is an SPRC matter to handle, then the church council needs to go into a closed session to handle that matter. We also talk about the Board of Trustees. Now, there are some important changes in the Board of Trustees. Notice this is not a committee, this is a board. Now, that's an important differentiation. Primarily, this is for legal purposes. Because of the structure of the Global Methodist Church, the trustees are a board for legal purposes. However, when we look at our polity, the Board of Trustees acts like a committee of the church council. We refer to the trustees as a board because they do hold legal responsibilities within the church. You can find those responsibilities listed in 346, but primarily they oversee care for property. They make building use decisions. So anytime an outside group wants to use the facility, the trustees are responsible for that. At St. Augustine Methodist Church, the trustees have written a building use policy that helps me know how to guide those decisions as pastor. The trustees also work with the SBRC and the pastor for parsonage maintenance upkeep. There are some important trustee matters that are not listed here. Some that have to do with money, have to do with trusts given to the church. Some of the legal functions, the detailed legal functions are not mentioned here, but they are in 346. Now, the Board of Trustees has to meet at least 3 times during the year. That's a requirement. Now, the trustees are the only committee that requires a true quorum, and that's a majority of the trustees. The other committees of the church, they simply require due notice of the meeting beforehand, and then a quorum are everyone, all members who are present. The trustees do require a quorum, and this goes back to some of their legal responsibilities. In order for the trustees to make a decision, there needs to be a quorum. There is some wisdom to that, to having all their trustees present. In fact, there's some wisdom to every committee meeting only when you have a majority present, and only doing so after a duly announced meeting that's been given every chance for people to attend. Let's go to the Finance Committee. Now, the Finance Committee are composed of very specific members. What do I mean by that? Well, 347.1 identifies people who need to be serving on the Finance Committee. So I don't have them listed here, but you need to go consult 347.1 to discern those members that need to be on that committee. The responsibilities of the Finance Committee are one of the most obvious. They deal with the finances of the church, the financial resources of the church. And so when there are matters that the trustees need or that the SBRC needs that involves finances, there needs to be a request submitted to the Finance Committee. At St. Augustine, our finance chair, one of our finance co-chairs, tries to be present at the trustee meetings, especially, and communicate with the Staff Parish Relations Committee chair when any financial matter comes up. So also the Finance Committee has appropriate collections processes. So making sure that our counting procedures are not just one person counting by themselves, and it's not just family members counting by themselves. We want to make sure we're accountable and we have good collection procedures. The Finance Committee is also responsible for dispersing and remitting designated funds. So if a gift is designated somewhere, the Finance Committee needs to keep a record of that. That's a legal fiduciary responsibility. The Finance Committee needs to be ready for and make provisions for an annual audit. That can be an in-house audit. That doesn't have to be one of the expensive outside audits, but we do need to do an annual audit to hold ourselves accountable and hold our Finance Committee accountable. Any budget changes year over year, they must be submitted to Church Council for approval. Notice the Church Council is the one with the charge conference that votes on and sets the budget. The Finance Committee drafts the budget, but they are not the ones who finally decide by themselves. Again, you need to go to 347. There's stuff not listed here, but I've listed the main stuff here. Okay, we go back to our flow chart and we see we've talked about the charge conference, which sometimes convenes as a church conference. We've talked about the church council, which for smaller churches is going to look different than larger churches, but we still have required functions of the church council, no matter how large or small our church is. Those required functions are found in the administrative function sections of this flow chart: nominations, trustees, finance, and SBRC, which may be referred to as PPRC in your church. Now, the church council needs to maintain a vision for the church's mission, which means our primary focus should actually be on the ministry functions of the church. What are we doing to make disciples of Jesus Christ? And even ordering our agenda to emphasize how we're making disciples of Jesus Christ and how we're going to do that as a church council. In part 2 of this video, we'll get into some of the details of local church membership. What's the difference between a professing member, a preparatory member, an associate member? There's many different membership categories. It's good to work through that, but for now, let's save that for part 2. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was beneficial to you. Again, check out part 2. I think that'll be very helpful for your local church's membership.